We're going to read for our text this morning, Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 26. This is a beloved passage of Scripture. We've read it many times before in the service, always inspiring to hear Paul's words, "For me to live is Christ." Philippians chapter 1, we're going to read verses 12 through 26. Now, as you're turning, let me give you the background of what we're going to be reading here. Paul was in a Roman prison cell when he wrote the book of Philippians. It was one of four epistles that Paul wrote in prison. This church, the Philippian church, Paul loved this church and they loved him. He was the founder of this church. It was the very first Christian church in Europe. They had gotten word that Paul was in prison and they were concerned about him. They had supported his ministry in the past through prayer, through encouragement, through finances. They had sent a messenger to Paul who had fallen ill along the way. Paul knew of their great concern, and he really is writing to reassure them, not to complain about, look how bad my life is, I'm in a prison. He wrote this letter to reassure them from a Roman prison cell. So let's read Philippians 1, verses 12 through 26. Paul writes, "Now I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Because of my chains, most of the brothers in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so in love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? One translation has that verse translated, so what? Or what of it? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. Because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help given by the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am going to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better for me by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your joy in Christ will overflow on account of me." Bill Wallace was one of our Southern Baptist missionaries. He was a medical doctor, and he went to China as a medical missionary in the 1940s. The communists took over China in 1949. They, of course, were opposed to any Christian missionaries being there. There was also a very strong anti-American sentiment in China at the time, and so Bill Wallace became a target for the Chinese government. He was arrested in 1950, and during his imprisonment, which lasted about 2 months, he was routinely beaten and interrogated and tortured. To keep his sanity during his imprisonment, he would scribble Bible verses on the prison wall. One day he was found dead in his prison cell. The Chinese government claimed that he had hanged himself, but it was clear to all who saw his body that he had been beaten to death. In defiance of the Chinese government, the Chinese Christians took his body out of the prison and they took him to a nearby cemetery that one of the Christian churches owned, and they buried him there in that Christian cemetery. And a verse is inscribed on his tombstone. It was one of the verses that he had written on his jail cell during his imprisonment. And the verse is from our text today. For me to live is Christ. This Southern Baptist missionary, almost 2,000 years after Paul lived, he found inspiration and encouragement in his circumstances by what Paul had lived in his circumstances. Bill Wallace understood from the scriptures that Paul had one agenda in life, and that was to live for Jesus Christ. And that's why Paul could say, no matter what my circumstances are, no matter what opposition I face, no matter what uncertainty there is in the future, for me, living is about one thing, Jesus Christ. And I want to show you from our text this morning what it can mean to your life when you can say with Paul, for me to live is Christ. Let's look first at verses 12 through 14. When we can say, for me to live is Christ, it can help us to overcome our own personal disappointments. Paul mentions in verse 12 the things that have happened to me. We know something from the book of Acts of how Paul got into this Roman prison cell. He was arrested in Jerusalem for preaching Christ. On the way to Rome, he was shipwrecked off the coast of Malta, rearrested, put into chains, and he arrived in Rome in chains and was taken to this jail cell. Now here he is, sitting in a Roman jail cell for nothing other than being a faithful Christian. We know from other letters that he had plans to go to the far ends of the earth with the gospel. Those were his dreams and hopes, and interestingly, his dreams and hopes always revolved around Christ. They always revolved around the gospel. We know almost nothing of what his personal desires and ambitions were. They were all gospel-focused. So his dreams, his hopes, his ambitions were to be free to take the gospel to the far ends of the earth. His reality is that he's in a Roman jail cell, in chains, chained to a palace guard. What he hoped for in life and what his reality was in life were 180 degrees apart, polar opposites. You ever feel that way? Maybe something in your family, it could be something in your job, it could be something in your personal life, but you feel like what you hope for in life and what you got out of life are polar opposites. Now, how was Paul able to keep his encouragement level up? How was he able to avoid the discouragement that might have crushed someone else? Well, look at what he says. He goes on to say in verse 12. He not only says what has happened to me, he says what has happened to me has been for the furtherance of the gospel, or has been used to advance the gospel. That word that's translated advance or further, it's a very picturesque word. It pictures someone who is marching out in front of an army, clearing a path. Like, say, with a machete, for example. You see those movies sometimes where a group of explorers, maybe they're going through a thick jungle or forest, and there's somebody there in the front of them who has a machete, and he's hacking his way, chopping his way through the jungle. That's the kind of word Paul uses here when he says that my imprisonment, my chains, have served to advance the gospel. How? in this age in which Paul lived, where there's no mass media, no social media, how could one little man's imprisonment in a Roman jail cell advance the gospel? Well, look at what he says in verse 13. It has become evident to the whole palace guard that I am wearing these chains for Christ. Now, the palace guard that Paul mentions here, these were the elite guards of the day. They'd be something akin to our social, what do they call the Secret Service. Not exactly, they were more elite than that. But they only worked for the Caesar and the Caesar's family. They guarded the Caesar. They were the elite of the elite. They were considered to be people of a very upper level in society. And so an ordinary citizen like Paul would never have even met these people. But now Paul says, because I'm chained to one of them, the palace guard, and they would have been working in shifts, and we don't know how long Paul was there, but for quite some time. So these guards would have been rotating in and out of his cell. Every time they go in, they're chained to him for 8 or 10 hours a day. And Paul said every one of them has heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. Isn't that something? These elite people who were way out of Paul's league in terms of social status, Paul says now, because of my chains, every one of them has heard the gospel of Christ. Isn't that a wonderful attitude? Instead of saying, look how miserable my life is, or look how unfair things have turned out for me, look how God has treated me, I only wanted to serve him and he lets me rot in a jail cell. Instead of that attitude, Paul says, because I'm in a jail cell, because I'm chained to a Roman guard, the Roman guards are hearing about Jesus Christ around the clock. Now, you know when you can say that? It's when you decide, like Paul decided, that my life is not about me anymore. It's about Jesus Christ. And everything that happens to me will be okay with me if it can advance the gospel and be for his glory. Do you know the story of Joni Eareckson, this 17-year-old, very faithful young Christian teenager? I guess this was back in the 70s. She was a swimmer, a diver, and she was involved in a diving accident, broke her neck. And at the age of 17, she became quadriplegic, paralyzed from the neck down. Still in a wheelchair. I saw her on TV recently. She wrote a book called Joni that sold tens of millions of copies. She wrote this later on about that accident that took her physical freedom from her. She wrote, I saw that my injury was not a tragedy, but a gift that God was using to help me conform to the image of Christ. Something that would mean my ultimate satisfaction, happiness, even joy. Now, she had learned what Paul was teaching here. That no matter what our personal disappointments are, when we decide my life isn't about me anymore, it's about Jesus Christ, then he can use our personal disappointments for his glory and to advance the gospel. Now look at the second thing. It's in verses 15 through 18. We've seen that when we can say, for me to live is Christ, it will help us to overcome personal disappointments. And in these verses, we can see that it helps us to transform difficult relationships. Paul says in verse 15 that while he's sitting there in a Roman jail cell, that some were preaching Christ out of envy and strife. And what he's saying there is that when they get up in the pulpit supposedly to be preaching Christ, what they're really doing is taking the time to run me down. They're getting up in the pulpit to talk dirt about me. And Paul doesn't go into detail on what it was, but it was probably something along the lines of, look at that guy Paul. You thought he was such a good Christian? Well, look at him now, sitting in a jail cell. You thought Paul was such a leader? Look at him now, he's in prison. You thought God was blessing Paul's ministry? Well, that ought to show you God's hand isn't on his ministry. Paul's sitting in prison. Have you learned this lesson yet? That not everyone who serves the Lord does so out of a pure motive. You're aware of that, right? I had a young pastor just a few weeks ago. He's in his first year in the pastoral ministry, and he came up to me and he said, there's a guy in my church, everything I say, he opposes it. Everything I propose, he's against it. No matter what I'm for, he's against it. No matter what I say, he opposes it. And he said, Pastor, have you ever had an experience like that? And I said, brother, been there, done that, got the t-shirt. I told you the story a couple of weeks ago in the sermon from James on the use of our words. I told you the story about that usher who would stand in the back of the church, and every time he'd hand out a bulletin, he'd run the pastor down. Here's your bulletin. We don't like the pastor. And then he'd come sit in the sanctuary and use that same mouth to sing praises to God. My father-in-law, who is a retired Baptist minister, he saw that sermon on YouTube, and he wrote me an email, and he said jokingly, I think I know that usher. And I wrote him back and said, every pastor in the world knows that usher. Or he knows someone just like him. I read once that, some of you may not know the name George Truett, but believe me, there was a generation where George Truett's name was known throughout the world. He was the very, very famous pastor of First Baptist Church of Dallas from 1897 to 1944 when he died, 47 years. He was considered to be the finest preacher among Baptists in the world of his era. He was called the Prince of Preachers. While he was still alive, people called him that. And he was probably the most famous Baptist in the world at the time. He very famously was invited to preach sermons on the steps of the U.S. Congress building. He was known to presidents and kings. You would think a man like that would have a ministry that was basically without opposition. I read a book, it was a biography of Truett, but it was written by one of the deacons of First Baptist Dallas, a man who was there for most of Truett's 47-year ministry. And one thing that he said in the book just absolutely floored me, and this man was a great admirer of Truett, the deacon who wrote the book. He said that during Truett's 47-year ministry, and admittedly this was a colossal church, one of the biggest churches in the world at the time, but he said during his 47-year ministry, there was hardly ever a time when there wasn't at least one petition circulating in the church calling for his dismissal. And it's not just preachers who face opposition. If you serve Christ, you're going to be opposed. And if you think you can serve Christ without opposition, wake up, because you're going to have it. If you think, for example, if you serve Christ faithfully at your job, that's going to make you popular at work, you better think again. I could tell you some stories that Mary's told me. You try to do the right thing at work, you try to live for Christ at work, you think that's going to make you popular in this wicked world? Think again. But do you require it to be that way? Will you only serve Christ if you can do so without opposition? You think in this wicked world it's going to be easy to serve Jesus? It's not. But do you require that it be easy? And will you only serve him if it's easy? Paul said, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter that people oppose me. I love how he says in verse 18, he said, look, as long as Christ is preached, I'm fine with it. And I told you some of the more modern translations, that verse that says, what of it? Some of the translations just, and I think it captures well what Paul was saying. Paul says, so what? So what? Because remember, he'd already decided my life isn't about me anymore. It's about Jesus. And so I don't care if they're running me down, so long as they're preaching Christ while they do it. And you may be having trouble with somebody. It may be a coworker, it may be a neighbor, maybe somebody in your own family. Writer of Proverbs says it's better to live on a rooftop than to dwell in a house filled with contention. Whoever's causing you the trouble, if in your mind you can just write, for me to live as Christ over that relationship, and say, you know what, this relationship isn't about me anymore, it's about Jesus. And so long as he can be glorified, so long as the gospel can be advanced through this relationship, I'm not going to worry about how it affects me personally. And then one more thing. When you can say, for me to live is Christ, verses 20 through 22. It'll help you to face future uncertainties. Now, you think Paul's future was very certain when he wrote this letter? He was in a Roman jail awaiting trial before Nero, the most unstable emperor to ever rule Rome. There's a reason today that people call their children Paul and their dogs Nero. Nero was crazy. He was unstable. Paul had no idea if he was going to live or die. I look at the future, say, of our country, for example, and for the first time in my life, I think I'm actually a little concerned. I mean, concerned to the point that I actually sort of think about it. My attitude has always sort of been, God's in control and I'm happy. But we're involved in a presidential election right now, unlike anything I've ever seen in my life. And evidently, over half the country doesn't really want either of the two candidates. And then you look globally at what's going on. We've got this immigrant crisis, I guess refugee crisis they're calling it, in the Middle East, with all the Muslims coming out. And maybe 99 out of 100 are wonderful people, but you keep hearing these stories that it's going to be some kind of a Trojan horse thing where terrorists are being put in with the groups that are coming out, and they're going into countries in Europe and now to America. It's enough to cause concern. And that's just the big picture. That's not talking about you and your concerns. You may be here today worried about your health. Or maybe someone in your family that you're concerned about. It may be a financial thing. I find myself, as I get nearer to retirement, for example, that it's there on the horizon and I can see it clearly. You start wondering, is there going to be enough money to live on for the rest of my life? All of these things that cause us concern. And so verses 20 to 22, Paul, he doesn't know whether he's going to live or die, but look what he says in verse 20, whether by life or death. He's saying it really doesn't matter to me. If I live, that's fine. He says, verse 22, if I live on in the flesh, that means fruit for my labor. What he's saying is, if the Lord lets me live, I'll just go on and do what I was planning on doing. I'm going to go to Europe, to Spain, start churches there, preach the gospel. And if I die, that's okay too. It's actually my preference, he said, because then I get to be with the Lord. You know why he could say that? That it didn't matter if he lived or died. It didn't matter if the Lord spared him or took him home. It's because Paul had already decided his life wasn't about him anymore. It was about Jesus. It's because he could say, for me to live is Christ. I read a parable a couple of weeks back. It was written by an English writer named G.K. Chesterton. There's about a little boy who is given a wish. He can choose to be made immensely large or infinitely small. Probably doesn't surprise you that in the story the little boy chooses to be made big. Gigantic, in fact. So large that in a matter of moments he could walk across a continent. So large that he could walk up to Mount Everest and kick it over. But within a matter of days he became bored. There was no one to play with, nothing to do. The whole world seemed as small as his own backyard. And then he realizes that if he had chosen to be made small, his own backyard would have seemed like the Amazon jungle. He could have spent a lifetime exploring just his own neighborhood. And the point Chesterton makes, Chesterton is a Christian writer, the point he makes is that it's human nature to want to be puffed up, to be big, to want to make ourselves seem important. But that in Christianity, it's counterintuitive, that the way to service and usefulness to God isn't to be made big, but to be made small. That's the essence of what Paul is saying here. That he got so small that he could say, my life is no longer about me. My life is about Jesus Christ. And because of that, I can take any personal disappointment, any difficult relationship, face any future uncertainty, because for me to live is Christ. How about you? Can you say that today? This morning we're going to sing as our song of invitation, hymn number 305. I have decided to follow Jesus.